Hello, my name is Bill Holstein, and I'm president of the Overseas Press Club Foundation. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you all for joining us in this most difficult and problematical year. We promise today we'll keep you for only 1 hour, much less than our normal luncheon. We lost two beloved board members this past year, one to COVID and one to time. So for the first time, we've chosen to dedicate this, our annual event, to their memory. Maria Mercader of CBS was among the first coronavirus victims last spring, and the amazing, wonderful Jackie Albert Simon passed away at the age of 98 this past summer. We're truly saddened by these losses, but we will keep going because they would want us to. And also during this difficult time, I want to thank the sponsors and patrons who have demonstrated their loyalty and commitment to our cause by standing with us. Our patrons include Bloomberg, Daimler, Reuters, Toyota North America, and our friends include the Associated Press, CBS News, Edelman, the Pamela Howard Family Foundation, Quest Diagnostics, S&P Global, and the Wall Street Journal. And of course, thanks to Jane Riley and her associate, Kat Riley, and to board member and former winner, Russell Midori of Drum Circle Media for producing and editing the videos. This past December, which is the deadline for applications for our competition, we were not at all sure that we would be able to keep our program going during this most difficult of times, during the middle of the pandemic. Who in their right mind would want to go abroad? We were not sure that any young person would wish to compete for one of our awards in the middle of the travel lockdowns affecting the entire world. So we were surprised and delighted that we received 150 applications from college students all across the country. And we were pleased that they were exceptionally strong in terms of their motivations and skill sets. And they're far smarter than I was. I can tell you this, when I first dreamed of becoming a foreign correspondent. Thanks to the board members who took part in that judging process and have already started coaching our young people. Before we launch into the heart of the program, one of the most important things the foundation has done is to be the sponsor for a culture of safety, the ACOS Alliance, which has pivoted during the pandemic to offer training and advice to young journalists about how to work safely and smartly during such hazardous times. Here's a brief intro to their work. We are obviously not eating lunch at the Yale Club, and we're not going to have a speaker today, but we will have a special presentation later, a look into how 3 winners from previous years have leveraged our platform, our foundation, to build successful careers. I'll be joined in that segment by Edie Lederer of the AP, a veteran of 50 years of covering the world. So the reason we're doing this is that we're launching an award in Edie's name today. So we thought it was time for her to get her feet wet, so to speak, and come to understand the impact her award will have on the lives of aspiring correspondents for many years to come. But first, let's meet the latest crop.
Soon after learning how to shift my motorbike's gears, I was cascading through the whirling roundabouts of Ho Chi Minh City. the newest tadpole in the school of motorists that packed the grand boulevards of Vietnam's largest city. It was loud, it was hot, it was wonderful. I would spend the next 3 weeks riding north along coastal highways, rural back roads, and taking in all that I could of a country eager to engage with a foolish American on 2 wheels. As an American, I think that we have a unique duty to engage with the rest of the world, one that is too often ignored within our own borders despite our outsized influence beyond them. As a foreign correspondent, I aim to bring an on-the-ground approach to my reporting, and to bring that outside world into the lives of our readers. Here at home, my favorite story I've written was about a dead man I never knew. I was an intern at the Seattle Times, writing the obituary for a beloved local writer. Interviewing his family, former colleagues, fallen-out friends, I was at times a fact-checker, a sounding board, a mediator. Eventually, I put together a portrait of the man, Dennis Eichhorn. After it was published, his widow, Jane, invited me to the memorial service. No other story I've written contained as many dimensions of what reporting can be like. It's an alchemy unlike any other. It pushes me out of my comfort zone, challenges me to act consciously, and to seek purpose in a world that too often rewards apathy. There's no better way to meet this challenge than working as a foreign correspondent, and I want to thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation for this award.
"5 years ago, I was sitting in the back row of a bus in southeast Turkey heading to Istanbul. The bus was full of young people, families with children. I picked up my phone and started talking to the guy sitting next to me. With the help of Google Translate, I asked him, "Why did you leave?" He texted 2 words: "No jobs." That was the beginning of my journey to wanting to be a foreign correspondent, focused on the global economic issues that are usually a core part of our most pressing local and global challenges. I had traveled to the Turkish-Iraqi border to look behind the anti-immigrant propaganda and report on the crisis that was gripping Europe. In addition to Kurdish protests and ISIS attacks, I also learned about factory closures, skyrocketing unemployment, soaring food and housing prices, and crashing economic production. Since then, whether investigating the net worth of the richest Hungarians for Forbes or breaking news about the latest M&A deals, my goal has been to help people understand the economy they live in and how each economic event may affect their lives. I'm grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for giving me the opportunity to pursue the crucial mission of foreign correspondence, to be the public's eyes on the world.
When I was in the 3rd grade, in a town outside of San Francisco, I interviewed my grandma for a report about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. My parents and grandparents originally came from the Soviet Union, and I wanted to hear firsthand what it had been like to live through such a traumatic event. My grandma surprised me by saying the traumatic event was learning the truth about Chernobyl years later. At the time of the meltdown in 1986, she had no idea anything serious had happened. I grew up in a family that constantly reminded me what it felt like to be denied access to independent information before they fled to the United States as refugees in 1994. Their stories of media blackouts and government propaganda inspired me to become a journalist. But it wasn't until a reporting trip to Kerala in southern India 2 years ago that I felt compelled to chronicle an environmental disaster much bigger than Chernobyl going on all around us: climate change. On that trip, I wrote about how a warming climate is endangering India's sacred groves. These old-growth forests are venerated by some for their religious significance and revered by many environmentalists and scientists for their remarkable and threatened biodiversity. Speaking to people who both worshipped in the groves and worked to preserve them encouraged me to develop my reporting skills by covering the human side of climate change. This OPC award will allow me to continue reporting on the effects of climate change around the world, providing crucial information communities can use to have agency over their lives. Thank you.
Richmond kids call them chevron sunsets, these blooms of red gold that swell from waterfront smokestacks at night and wash over the San Francisco Bay. Richmond, California is my town, and many of those kids are students in my mother's AP Environmental Science course. There's a mural of the oil refinery outside of her classroom, and inside, many students learn for the first time that Chevron pays out millions of dollars in air pollution fines every year, and that our community has some of the highest rates of heart disease and asthma in the state. This taught me that public understanding of the facts isn't inevitable. The stories we're told about our worlds influence how we act and how urgently. That's why I became a health and environment reporter. But just focusing on my own backyard isn't enough. As we've all seen this year, pathogens and pollution don't recognize political boundaries. And communities on the edges often pay the highest price. I saw this firsthand reporting on a Norwegian copper mine that plans to dump its waste into a fjord that indigenous fishermen have relied on for thousands of years. But I believe that great storytelling works as an active translation. It gives us the tools to turn the distant or the abstract, urgent and personal. That's the work of the foreign correspondent, and with the support of the Overseas Press Club Foundation, it's a work I'll be honored to undertake. Thank you.
Gelato led me to journalism. When I was younger, my parents moved our family from Louisville, Kentucky to rural Italy to learn how to make authentic gelato. They were successful, and a few years later we moved back to Kentucky to open our own gelato shop, which I lived over until I moved away to college. This is an unusual kind of migration story, and it was an unusual way to grow up. But for me, it sparked a deep fascination with immigration into Italy, which culminated with a 2019 reporting trip to the Italian island of Lampedusa. Lampedusa is actually closer to the coast of Tunisia than it is to the coast of Sicily, which has long made it a popular destination for migrants trying to enter Europe. In 2019, it was also the site of a standoff between the hardline anti-migrant Minister of the Interior, Matteo Salvini, and NGO rescue ships trying to drop off their charges.
I ask your cooperation to disembark the 42 people who I have on board. Over.
While I was there, I got a tip from a local activist that an NGO ship would soon go against Salvini to enter Italian territorial waters. So when I saw a cameraman sprinting towards the harbor, I followed him, and I got there just in time to see the Sea-Watch 3 come in. In the following days, the ship's captain was arrested, and the Sea-Watch 3 became international news, covered by outlets like the BBC and the New York Times.
Migrants rescued.
That moment gave me the confidence that as long as I do my homework, do good sourcing, and follow my instincts, I am capable of covering big, important stories. This award is an incredible honor, and I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
I was standing outside a migrant shelter in Nogales, Mexico, when Rafael, an undocumented immigrant, told me that he left his hometown of Zacatecas, Mexico in 1986. He was living with his family for 30 years in Flagstaff, Arizona, until recently local police pulled him over for driving with a broken taillight. When they asked him about his immigration status and he couldn't produce documents, he was promptly deported to Mexico. When we spoke 2 days later, he was still wearing the same clothes in which he was deported. His family was still in Arizona. That summer, Rafael was one of the many migrants that I met while undertaking an independent immigration and border journalism fellowship in southern Arizona, where I grew up. That experience ignited my passion for journalism. And with that, I'd like to thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation for sparking this passion even further and inspiring me to continue telling stories that lead to social change, bridge borders, and hold people and institutions accountable. I plan to use the Overseas Press Club grant to fund my summer reporting for the Los Angeles Times in Washington, D.C., and hope to make you all proud. Thank you again.
If you've ever been hospitalized in this country, you've probably been treated by a nurse from the Philippines. But until COVID came, I had no idea. It wasn't until I started to hear about the high number of deaths among Filipino nurses that I dig down to figure out why. And the numbers were shocking. Filipino nurses made up about 30% of all nursing deaths, despite only being 4% of American nurses. These nurses were shouldering more risk in order to keep Americans alive and dying as a result of it. This January, I reported that story for the New York Times Metro desk. The story that I ended up writing was about nurses who had been pulled into the American healthcare system for decades. And it was about how when a pandemic hit, they became disposable. Despite being so essential to our hospitals that we recruit them from the other side of the world. I found an international story in New York City, but maybe that's not so surprising. I've been around international stories my whole life. I grew up between Rome and the US, and I spent most of my working career in Southeast Asia.
Like so many of us, for me, journalism was a cure for the curious lifestyle. But I'm still curious, and like so many who have joined this organization before me, I'm here to follow where that curiosity leads. To find stories that might surprise you, and to help explain the fabric of the world in which we live in today. Thank you so much.
On June 1st, 2020, I was at the biggest protest France had ever seen against police brutality and racism. It was a week after the death of George Floyd, and that summer, my home country erupted in protests against racism and police violence. That was major because talking about race in France is really difficult. We don't collect statistics on race, and we even banned the word from the Constitution. That summer, I worked with the AP and tried to scratch to see what is behind that silence. I looked into racial inequalities in our healthcare system and the ways France's former colonies that are now part of France remain neglected by the mainland. That summer strengthened my resolve to dig where powers don't want me to report on underreported, neglected communities, to bring light to those who seek justice and fairness. And I hope to continue this with the OPC Scholarship. Thank you for your support.
I was in high school in the Philippines when 32 journalists were massacred in broad daylight. It was the deadliest attack on the press in history. When I told people I wanted to pursue journalism school still, I would often be asked some version of, "How does that make your parents feel?" The aftermath of the massacre exposed deep flaws in the justice system, but journalists are still a privileged group. I knew that if the system was failing journalists, then there must be countless others, millions of Filipinos, who it was failing to. To tell these stories was my guiding light years later, when Rodrigo Duterte assumed power. I covered drug war victims, jailed activists, and the harassment of colleagues, even as our own newspaper was subject to Duterte's vitriol. I watched an authoritarian bug take hold in my country and throughout the region. In 2019, a decade after the massacre, a court finally handed down the first guilty verdicts. In a full circle moment, I was one of the reporters out covering that day. Jay Duhai, who was grade 4 when his father was killed in the attacks, said of the verdicts, "It was like a weight had been crushing us for 10 years, and now we can be whole again." A journalist's most valuable currency is still hope, in the inevitability of justice, and in the role our work must play in delivering it. Thanks to the Overseas Press Club, I'm really looking forward to playing that role across Southeast Asia. Thank you.
When I was a consultant with Deloitte, one thing I learned is that if you want to understand how a business works, you've got to go see how their operations work on the ground. And so that's why when I was advising a mining company, I went to the mine, not just to ask mine operators about how disruptive technology was changing their work, but to watch those changes happen in real time. I've used the same approach as a business reporter. When I was covering Canadian startups at Y Combinator, that's why I went to San Francisco and stood in the same rooms as founders and venture capitalists and watched them make deals in front of my very eyes in a matter of minutes. And that's the approach that I intend to use abroad as I cover international businesses and how their work is affecting customers and employees that live in some of the most underreported and remote regions of the world. I'd like to go to India and to Nigeria, where you have technology which is skipping a generation. You've got people who have never even lived on electrical grids who are now using smartphones to do mobile banking. I'd like to understand who's behind these developments. And are these initiatives employing people locally? Are they really as good as they seem? To answer these questions, I've got to talk to local individuals, talk to experts who are living there, and prioritize local perspectives. And with the help of the OPC Foundation, I'm excited to do exactly that. I'd like to thank Jerry Flint's family for this tremendous honor, and I'm excited to get to work.
I seek unfamiliar experiences to find common threads. For 2 years, I lived in a modest home without running water or electricity in Lesotho in southern Africa. I wasn't a journalist, but I would soon become one. At first, I was a grant writer, securing funding to investigate an attempted coup. I was also a radio manager, creating an advertising plan to fund HIV and AIDS health programming. But when the WHO predicted that 750,000 Basotho would face famine from drought, there was no role I could fill. We lined up to fetch water at 3 a.m. My neighbors slaughtered their starving cattle, and NGOs prepared emergency relief. And then it happened, a pair of unexpected sights and sounds, the patter of water hitting roofs and the community singing their hearts out. It had started to rain. At that moment, I wished I'd documented my neighbors' experiences as their culture confronted the deadly impact of climate change head on. I changed my path. Since then, video and photojournalism has taken me to the epicenters of climate change to document cultural resilience. In Belize, I worked with a mine conservationist who fights to protect the coral reef against increasing bleaching and invasive species. In North Carolina, I documented the impact of coal ash pollution on public health. And soon I will go to Kenai, Alaska, to highlight the growing threat of marine heat waves on commercial fishers. With the support of the Overseas Press Club Foundation, I'm confident in my path as a visual journalist whose mission is not to be understood, but to understand. Thank you.
Good evening. Hong Kong, 2019. Let me set the scene. It was total chaos. Alarms were blaring. Students were screaming in Cantonese from the pain of tear gas. The sounds of round after round of plastic bullets hitting umbrellas was deafening. Fires raged from Molotov cocktails, and I was in the middle of it all, a journalism student.
Police force are pushing back with water cannons.
I had a sense of urgency to tell the story unfolding right before my eyes. My journalistic instincts kicked in. I had a mental checklist of all the things that I needed to get done before the night was over if I wanted to tell this story accurately. So I used my phone to record interviews, B-roll, and stand-ups. All of the footage and notes I had on my phone eventually turned into an interactive multimedia piece. This piece documented the days leading up to my semester coming to an end. This incident sparked my interest in international reporting, which led me to apply for the OPC Foundation opportunity to report overseas. Winning this award is like a dream come true. I love to tell stories about people from different regions and different cultures, and I'm excited to continue to learn, grow, and adapt as I pursue my career as an international reporter.
I am a Nigerian-American woman and a child of immigrants. There aren't a lot of international business correspondents that look like me, but I see that as an advantage. My identity gives me the ability to see great stories where others may not and amplify voices that are often overlooked in the news. 3 years ago, when I was an intern at the U.S. Department of State, I had the opportunity to interview North Korean defectors and Chinese nationals who had been persecuted for their religious choices. It was in that moment that I realized great journalism is not just about the facts. It's also about the human beings who have incredible stories to tell. When their experiences are highlighted, it can influence policymakers in Washington or keep us informed of an everyday reality we may never have to experience. The OPC Foundation Fellowship will give me the opportunity to meet people around the world and recount their stories of triumph and failure. In doing so, I hope to hone my skills as an international correspondent and fulfill my dream to engage in the kind of reporting that includes compelling and strong storytelling.
When I was 22, I took a big leap of faith and I moved to Brazil as an aspiring journalist. I had no experience and no contacts, but I learned the ropes in the field, and before too long, I was freelancing for some of the world's largest media outlets. It was a dramatic and complicated time to be covering South America's largest country, with violence and deforestation in the Amazon on the rise and a multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal in the election of Jair Bolsonaro. In 2018, I had the opportunity to go cover a crisis that was unfolding in the country to my north. The situation in Venezuela was rapidly deteriorating, and nearly 1,000 Venezuelans were crossing on foot into Brazil every day in a remote border town on the outskirts of the Amazon basin. That's where I found Norelis Rojas, a Venezuelan refugee with 2 children trying to come to Brazil. Her Venezuelan money was worthless. She couldn't afford a bus ticket to get into the metropolitan areas where she could find work. Locals in the Brazilian town had violently attacked the Venezuelans' makeshift camps weeks before, so every night she walked a kilometer back into Venezuela. I was really struck by how far Norelis had come in order to be stuck in this kind of immigration limbo. I reported on her story, trying to put a human face on a humanitarian crisis and explain the everyday challenges of being a refugee. Reporting on the Venezuelan migration crisis made me realize that I really wanted to cover Latin America as a region. So I now hope to use my time in graduate school and my award from the Overseas Press Club to become a regional correspondent in Latin America.
I started covering the food industry during a summer of funerals for Midwestern meatpacking workers. I wrote about an industry-wide system that coerces sick employees into continuing to work. I wrote about the rags that people tied around their faces instead of masks and workers' fears that they wouldn't survive the pandemic. I could hear my sources gasp for air when they talked with me since their lungs had been so weakened by COVID-19, and people often cried as they told me about watching their loved ones who worked in meatpacking plants get sick and die as companies refused to implement even basic safety procedures. I think that drawing attention to broken systems and telling the stories of people who have been hurt by them is an incredible privilege, and it's one of the reasons why I became a journalist. I'm graduating this spring, and I'm excited to keep doing reporting that tells the stories of people who have been overlooked. I'm also half Chinese, and I'm really familiar with the injustices and inequities that exist in the Chinese-speaking world. I've always wanted to do this kind of reporting from East Asia, and I hope that this award from the Overseas Press Club Foundation will help me reach that goal.
Four years ago, I arrived in Salvador, Brazil, without speaking a single word of Portuguese. I was a Spanish-speaking South Korean who had grown up in Hong Kong and had plans to study in the United States. Not yet a journalist, but an avid writer. As someone whose identity embraces multiple places, I've always been drawn to opportunities to create new routes in unfamiliar ground. During my time in Brazil, the writer in me became a curious journalist, fascinated by people of all ages and places trying to remain rooted in a world that is quickly changing. Ever since, I've written about how tourism is transforming multicultural food traditions in Macau and what this means for the legacy of Portuguese colonial rule in the region. In Seoul, the city where I was born, I've written about how poetry traditions are being revived in unlikely ways. This meant weeks spent in the world of text message poetry competitions and sonnets in the subway, as well as the works of a 76-year-old man who has, over the course of 3 long decades, plastered hundreds of poems on mountains and walkways across our shared city. With the support of the Overseas Press Club, I hope to continue reporting stories like these at the intersections of themes such as migration, cities, and people. I'd also love to return to Brazil, this time fluent in Portuguese with a reporter's notebook in hand, representing a profession that teaches us to fall in love with new places and new ideas over and over again. Thank you.
On a sunny February day in 2020, I sipped on a mediocre latte at a coffee shop in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Across from me sat a woman with shimmering auburn hair and candy pink lipstick. I'll call the woman Mariana, a pseudonym she adopted for her own safety because she's a leading transgender activist in a culturally conservative country. I had the privilege of reporting on Mariana and other inspiring characters while living in Kazakhstan. Until my senior year of college, I never thought I'd be reporting on countries as far away as Kazakhstan. But then I read Susie Hansen's book, Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World. The book laid bare America's tragic myopia and motivated me to report on foreign nations. Unfortunately, my time in Kazakhstan was cut short due to the pandemic, but I was there long enough to know that foreign reporting is my calling. Even when travel restrictions confined me to my parents' basement in Minnesota, I reported on countries as far away as Thailand and Russia. As the world rights itself and as borders open, I'm eager to report abroad in the field once again. It's my hope that my reporting will interrogate the myth of American exceptionalism and that my focus on social justice will spur real change. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to resume the work I started.
Isn't it just incredible? Every year they come. We explain how difficult, how impossible it is to break into this business, but they say, just give us a chance. One of the most important things that the foundation does, I should note at this point, is teaching our winners how to better communicate. And this year's crop of winners has certainly shined very brightly in that department. Joining in this next pre-recorded segment are Dake Kang of the AP in Beijing, Portia Crowe in Paris, and Jacob Kushner in Nairobi, with Edie Lederer and myself. Let's hear what they have to say. Hi, I'm Bill Holstein. For those of you who don't know Edie Lederer, she's been with the Associated Press for more than 5 decades. She's worked all over the world and covered basically everything, starting in earnest with the Vietnam War. We competed when we were both based in Hong Kong, and I worked for the late lamented United Press International. I won't review any of those gory details of that period of our time together, but we thought it would be fun and possibly quite valuable to have Edie take the lead in talking to our previous winners today as part of our program. They're obviously at much earlier stages of their careers than Edie and myself, but their experiences could help us improve our program and also be of use possibly to this year's winners who have been invited to view this. With us today are Dake, Kang, who's done an incredible job for the AP in Beijing, Hong Kong, Wuhan, and Xinjiang, all the garden spots. He's zooming in from Beijing, so it's late evening there. Portia Crowe, who started off as a mild-mannered business journalist from Saskatchewan, has now become a hardcore correspondent in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. She's based in Paris, where she's calling in from. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, and BBC, among other outlets. And we have Jacob Kushner, who's done extremely well for himself from Nairobi, where Edie also worked at one point. Jacob's most recent coup was an article in National Geographic about the collision between people and hippopotamuses thanks to climate change. So this is a truly global event. Edie, I turn the conversation over to you. I'll be lurking over your shoulder, but have at it.
I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel with Bill. We both loved being foreign correspondents. And if you hear a touch of envy at what the three of you are doing in my voice, it's real. So why don't you each tell us briefly what drove you to be a foreign correspondent and how you got where you are today? Dake, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I am Korean American, born in New Jersey, but kind of raised all over the place. Spent a few years in Shanghai when I was growing up, and it just kind of sparked this interest in actually just the differences between different places, shuttling back and forth between Korea, China, and the US. And obviously part of the reason why I ended up coming back to China as well. When I was living in Shanghai, I picked up some Chinese, and I think, when I was going to college, I've always been very curious. I interned for CNN, and it was during the 2013 coup. And it was I just knew that was it. I really wanted to see history unfold right in front of me. But I knew that sitting in an office wasn't for me. So that's how I ended up in all these different places that Bill mentioned, Wuhan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang, and a lot of other places besides that.
Portia? What about you?
Sure. So I'm Canadian, so I've been abroad for a very long time, ever since going to school in the States. And I have always been, you go to journalism school and you meet a lot of people who love storytelling. They love the idea of stories or just the act of writing or producing film. But I've always been interested in the issues, I guess, and the content. And I went to journalism school wanting to be a foreign correspondent because I cared and enjoyed reading deeply about the world and wanted to participate in that. However, I did become a business journalist as well. And that I was a full-time sort of business correspondent for about 4 years. And I continue to do some business reporting, which actually really helps with my foreign correspondence as well. But I've been fully freelance for 2.5 years, based in Europe, but traveling around the world, as Bill mentioned, often in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and around Europe. Yeah, I'm very happy to be doing both, primarily that, but a bit of business journalism as well.
Jacob?
Yeah, I'm from Wisconsin, and through college was there. And yeah, by the time I graduated, I had worked for all the different newspapers there were to work for, and including editing the Spanish newspaper there. And yeah, when I graduated, I just decided to get out. And similar to what Dake said, I didn't want to just be at a desk. And so I moved down to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I had lived in the Dominican Republic and Haiti during study abroad during college. And yeah, I just moved down there. It was right after Haiti's earthquake, and began reporting and investigating foreign aid to Haiti after that 2010 earthquake there. And I ended up getting some gigs with the Associated Press. A stringer there gave me a bit of a chance. And yeah, just ended up spending a couple of years in Haiti freelancing. And I transitioned to grad school because I wanted to move away from breaking news a little bit toward breaking and investigative toward long form magazine journalism. and that sort of thing. So yeah, I went to Columbia and really learned a lot about writing and the process. And then thankfully OPC sent me to where I had been itching to go, over to East Africa. So I did my master's thesis on Chinese investment and engagement in Congo. So I wanted to go to Congo, but then the AP said, hey, you did a good job in Haiti, come with the OPC's help, come over to Nairobi. And yeah, things took off fast because my very first week there was the Westgate Mall terrorist attack, when the terrorist group Al-Shabaab stormed a shopping mall here. Anyways, a number of people were killed. And the police response to that was, frankly, in the aftermath, to crack down on Muslims and immigrants here in Nairobi. So from the get-go, I was reporting on violence against immigrants at the hands of the police and at the hands of other people, which led me to reporting on the violence against LGBT refugees in Africa, and eventually led me to Germany, where I spent a year investigating violence by Germans against immigrants in Germany, which has now just led to a book project that I'm starting. So yeah, just kind of mostly based here in Nairobi, reporting on everything from wildlife and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, just the ability to be abroad and be traveling around, with some exceptions during times of COVID, has been just so exciting. And freelancing has allowed me to focus on so many different types of stories, from wildlife to health, politics to migration. So yeah, I think that's what I like about it, is the ability to pursue all sorts of different stories for all sorts of different publications.
So Jacob just mentioned what I was going to ask you all about next. You've spent the past year working, or trying to work, in a pandemic that shut down most of the world. How have you managed, and what obstacles have you faced? Let's start with Portia.
Sure. So I was one of the first sort of recipients of the OPC freelancer grant. So thank you very much for that. I think you've done a few rounds since then, but back last spring, I think it was sort of April, May, when that grant was first announced. And myself and a lot of freelancers I know were sort of struggling financially because we lost some anchor clients. A lot of publications sort of started reeling in any money that they had, nervous about losing advertisers and that sort of thing. So it was a scary moment, but then sort of with the help of a few organizations like that, got through the initial sort of concerns around the pandemic and potential loss of clients. But it's been busy. I mean, I know many journalists who have kind of recognize the pandemic for what it is, as a major story, and found ways to cover it. For me personally, it's complicated my sort of routine of traveling quite a bit, being based in Europe and traveling to other parts of the world. So that was sort of put on hold. I started filing more dispatches from Europe amid the pandemic. So I'm actually kind of based between Zurich and Paris, so from both Switzerland and France. It's one of these things where everything is about the pandemic. So even as I continue to do the occasional sort of business correspondence, it's about how our business is changing with people working from home, or how is real estate changing. And I mean, there's a million stories within the pandemic. So I guess it was sort of scary at first, but then thankfully like a sort of an interesting chance to adapt and find new stories and new content.
I was part of that OPC grant giving, and the conditions we found on the ground were very tough. Basically, the whole ecosystem of freelancing is at stake. And so we've tried to give $750 and $1,000 micro grants out to help keep some people alive. And so, but it's still very much in doubt that that ecosystem can survive if this goes on much longer.
Jacob, what about you in the pandemic?
Yeah, I also was fortunate enough to be given an OPC microgrant, which was one of the first things that helped me do reporting during the pandemic. Even though there was a lockdown here in Kenya, I was able to travel to do this story on human-wildlife conflict that got picked up by Nat Geo. So that's a big thing. And Bill, on that note, Bill, I think it's great that a lot of organizations are also looking to support local journalists and local freelancers as well, because as hard as some of us have been hit by, I also lost actually about a 6-month project that I had just completed that just didn't get published and I wasn't paid for due to advertisers pull out at a publication. But imagine, these local journalists and fixers who rely on us even as freelancers sometimes. So I think a lot of people are struggling, and it's great that there are organizations that they're helping. Some people, who do breaking news, I think maybe they focused on the pandemic. That was the big story. Everyone wanted to read about it. A colleague and I actually got together and pitched a project about called Stopping the Next One, where we actually were planning on traveling to each continent to focus on a different zoonotic disease, a different animal-borne disease on each continent, and look at the risks there and the scientists who were studying that disease on the front lines, often local scientists from those countries, from those communities, to look at how important it is to fund research and the research necessary to find future pathogens and prevent the next pandemic. And so luckily BBC picked up that series in a big way, and throughout the year we were able to do that, although again, we weren't able to travel like we had planned, but it turned out great because we ended up working with local journalists as fixers in each of the continents, each of the places where we were doing those stories. And then many times the scientists themselves were able to take photos in the field when they're vaccinating monkeys against disease or this or that. They, through training sort of by us, a lot of the scientists themselves were able to record footage and we did live interview tapes in the field. So yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge, but also really great working with scientists and sources themselves, as well as local journalists around the world, and learning how to collaborate, during these times when travel is difficult.
Dake?
Yeah, I mean, I think my life in the past year has been defined by the pandemic, as everyone else has. But I was probably the earliest to get there. I was actually in Wuhan, in that tiny window between when the government had declared that it was person-to-person transmissible and when they shut down the city. I'd actually left Wuhan something like 14 or 16 hours before the government had shut it down. It was quite shocking to me because actually the colleague that I had gone with, when I had gone to Wuhan, I was thinking it was actually pretty okay. There were still quite a few pedestrians out and about walking. People we interviewed said, oh, it's just wearing masks. Everyone's out eating and having a good time. It's just wearing masks. That's all. And I had a bit of a debate with my colleague who actually has a degree in biology, who is saying, oh, I'm really nervous about the situation, there's got to be some kind of cover up because there's so many people out and about right now. And I was saying, well, it seems fine. And she was like, Dake, what if they shut down the city tomorrow? I was like, what are you talking about? That'd be totally unprecedented, which, obviously she was completely right. And so the lesson is to listen to your wiser colleagues. I think after that, it was just a lot of reporting on the pandemic, and I really honed in on the government response to the coronavirus at the beginning, because I think that was kind of the big, gigantic question mark, was what exactly had the authorities known about the pandemic, and to what extent were they being transparent, and to what extent weren't they being transparent? And this was a question that I basically sought to answer with some of my colleagues over the course of the past year. Some very
Jake, how long were you in Wuhan for?
Consuming stories. I was there for 2 days, I think. It was not a very long. It was in that tiny little window between when we realized it was going to be a really big deal and when the government shut the city down.
Wow.
And so that was kind of the last opportunity.
That's like being in the scene of an atomic bomb going off in Japan or something. You were present at that moment. Holy shit.
Yeah. Well, I did not realize just how significant it was going to be, and it was really tough because obviously reporting conditions in China are not great, to put it mildly, and this was a very sensitive topic. But I think we were able to get more information about what happened than I had expected, which was gratifying. It was quite a year.
That's fascinating. Dake just mentioned something about working conditions. So, the conditions that are out there now are very different than the pre-computer and pre-cell phone era that I operated in Vietnam, which I must say did have its advantages. For one thing, no boss could call you in the middle of the night. And there wasn't the kind of micromanaging coverage and reporting that exists today. So Jacob, what's it like covering the backwaters of Africa and the Caribbean and some of the investigative stories you've done elsewhere in terms of conditions working?
in governments and government harassment and things like that?
Yeah, Kenya certainly isn't the worst country in the world when it comes to government harassment of the press, but there are a lot of issues for local journalists, especially who report on politically sensitive topics. Since I'm reporting for international audiences, I'm not reporting on political parties that often and that sort of thing, but it's been rough here for some of my colleagues. I think one of the things that I was reporting on that was at least a risk here was since about 2013, I've been reporting on police brutality and extrajudicial killings by police, which of course this past year in the United States and around the world has been getting more attention finally. But back when I was, starting that reporting, there was, just this assumption that sort of here that police would kill suspects in the war on terror. But really what that turned out to mean is just police going around killing Muslims to make it look like they were doing something about the terrorist threat from Al-Shabaab after that Westgate Mall attack that I covered. So, I would meet the families of victims who were very afraid to speak because maybe the soldiers who had murdered their son in one case were just down the road within eyesight of where we were sitting in their homestead. And, the biggest challenge was protecting sources, really. Although, I don't think the danger to myself was anywhere near the danger to these families who had a loved one killed by police. I investigated all throughout the country kind of police killings of people, and we wanted to name names and name the police officers and up the line of command the people responsible for these killings. And I think what was interesting is that it wasn't really until this past year that when extrajudicial killings in the United States really came on to really got international and quite widespread national attention that even extrajudicial killings in Kenya and other places in the world did as well.
Dake, I think we'd all like to hear from you about the new pressures that the Chinese government is bringing to bear on Western journalists, including you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, conditions have never been great in China. Obviously there's tight censorship. And as foreign journalists, we are able to write uncensored, but that does mean that there is extra scrutiny of our movements and our work and the people that we speak to, precisely because we are, a relatively free source of information. And that has definitely intensified recently. Back in last March, almost exactly a year ago, actually, I woke up to the news that probably half the American journalists in China had been expelled. Fortunately, I was not one of them, but I knew a lot of the people who had gotten expelled back then, and it was a clear sign to us all that we had to be careful. That did seem to be more about international geopolitics and this growing spat between the U.S. government and the Chinese government. But in general, on a day-to-day level, it is definitely getting tighter. When we go to certain places in China, we may get followed by undercover police or by government officials. And I do think that is becoming a more frequent occurrence. And sometimes that means that we will not be able to meet sources, or, obviously we have to be mindful of what we tell our sources or what we ask them, because that could invite unwanted attention. There have been cases in which sources I've talked to have gotten in trouble. And they're speaking to me, right? So they know what they're getting, they're accepting interviews, and a lot of the people do know what the potential consequences are, but it's still very sobering to think that the people that we speak to can get in trouble, and sometimes do get in trouble. So a lot of the things that Jacob said about source protection very much apply. I would say that it's a bit different from other places in the sense that, I think if you're in the Middle East or Africa or Russia or Latin America, there's the danger can be quite physical. There's shootings or harassment by gangs or militias, or if it's a war zone, there's bullets flying around or artillery strike. There's none of that in China. China's it's a very safe place, but they're very, very sophisticated in terms of monitoring our communications, and that is really something that we have to be aware of.
Portia, you've also been covering Africa. What have conditions been like for you?
a story that comes to mind is not too long before the pandemic, I was in Uganda, and I did a number of stories, but one of them was about the LGBT community, which is kind of a fairly controversial issue in Uganda. 10 years ago, there was an attempt to introduce a law that would make gay sex punishable by death. And there was some talk about kind of, I guess, end of 2019 when I was there, not long before the pandemic, about bringing back a similar kind of law or some form of legislation. So kind of, I guess I just sort of would reiterate what Jacob said, which is that I didn't feel unsafe for myself. I mean, worst case, maybe I get sort of hauled into questioning at the airport on my way out or something. But it was much more about the sources, protecting the sources. And other, you know, any fixers or sort of, I didn't really use fixers, but sort of just chatting with local journalists and asking, or activists and asking, you know, do you know anyone? Can I chat with? Oh, a friend of yours, can we get coffee? And it was really sort of just being careful about physical, sort of the ways that we were physically meeting. So like Jacob said also, you know, like, can we meet in a cafe? Or are you not comfortable with being in public with, you know, with a white person that, you know, would maybe draw attention? But also the sort of the cyber, to Dake's point, the cyber security aspect of it as well. You know, making sure that, you know, I'm using the right sort of apps on my phone and storing my data and my reporting in sort of the safest way possible, because I am also crossing airports, and so, you know, can get sort of searched in that sense, because I'm not based there all the time. So yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a sort of a one-off case. I mean, Uganda is kind of a unique government. I can also speak to Europe. I mean, in France, I can definitely say that politically the situation is worse for journalists and getting tougher, you know, over the last few years since the Gilets jaunes protests, but even just a couple months ago, the government tried to pass a law banning journalists or anybody from filming the police in any context in France. So, you know, that doesn't sound like, you know, the liberté, sort of freedom-loving country that France likes to pretend to be.
One of the things that's changed since Edie and I were in the game was that back then you knew where the front lines were in the world, but today the front lines are everywhere, aren't they? Being a woman correspondent might enhance your ability to get people to trust you, might make you a better correspondent, but on the other hand, it might also expose you to different risks and higher risks. So what is it like being a woman on the ground in Uganda and parts of Africa?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I certainly recommend anyone, man or woman or any gender, to take sort of a risk security course if you can, if you're going abroad. I took one about a year ago, January 2020, just before going to Niger for a project. And yeah, I mean, there's some gendered aspects to the, sort of your security risk plan when you're planning it. If anything, and I think I've said this before, I've had probably more frustrating experiences as a woman correspondent on Wall Street and in the city of London than I have sort of anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa.
That tells you something right there.
What incredible fun we had talking to those young people. Just days after we recorded that segment, we learned that Dake Kang had won an OPC award for his coverage of China. I congratulated him in an email for winning the award. And here's part of what he said. It was a bit surreal, Bill. It wasn't so long ago when I came to the fellowship luncheon and sat in awe, intimidated by all the journalists and editors around me. Never had I imagined I'd be joining you in winning an OPC award myself. It turned out that Dake had won the Roy Rowan Award, and Roy, who's covered the Chinese Civil War, was one of my greatest heroes. So for me personally, this is incredibly sweet. I happened to win an OPC award for my coverage of China a few years ago when I was working for United Press International. I had no idea what it meant, but Dake understands that he is now an award-winning foreign correspondent. And he isn't the only such winner we've produced. Others include Ben Taub, Ben Hubbard, Wei Ling Ling, Emily Steele, Paul Sony, Eddie O, and others. That's what we do at the OPC Foundation. We're creating entire generations of correspondents who will uphold and reflect the best of journalistic values long after I've gone up to the great newsroom in the sky. I am abjectly grateful to our board and to all of you today who are watching and supporting our crucial mission. Our luncheon last year was on Friday, February 28th, the same day that the first COVID case was diagnosed in New York. What an incredibly dramatic moment that was. And what a journey we have been on to preserve and expand our program. Our complete program, by the way, can be found on the OPC YouTube channel. Join us, won't you? Next February 25th, 2022, we will still be in business. Thank you and goodbye for now.